Okay. Hello, everybody. Shavuot Tov. Let us get started. Tonight, we are going to prepare for Shavuot. By the way, this is what we just used for Havdalah. Usually I remember to move it. Today I did not. I will try not to be distracted by it. We're getting ready for Shavuot, and I want to share two of my favorite teachings from the Kedushat Levi. And I think the overarching question that I want us to start with is where is Torah? Where do we find Torah? Where was Torah before the Torah was given? That's the question I want us to think about as we start our learning tonight. And we're going to study two texts. Shalom again, Bruno. I'm glad you're joining us. And of course, as we study, feel free to add questions and comments in the chat, and we'll address them during the course of our learning together. So our first teaching comes. It's actually it's a few paragraphs taken out of a larger essay actually on Purim, but he takes a minute and talk about the power of the power of standing at Sinai and what that symbolized as far as the Torah. And the text that he's going to address ultimately is from Dayenu. And you might remember Dayenu, of course, from Passover. And we say in the course of that song, we say, if God brought us to Mount Sinai, but did not give us the Torah, Dayenu. It sounds on the surface like that would be very awkward if God brought us to Mount Sinai and then just sent us away. But he says, no, just standing at Mount Sinai had a unique power to it. And that's what we're about to learn together. So we're going to start from the middle of this section. He says, Ramach Mitzvot Aseh v'Shasa Lo Ta'aseh. The 248 positive mitzvot and the 365 negative mitzvot. So for those who are familiar, there are 613 commandments, and they are separated into 248 positive ones, i.e., do this. we shake a lulav, we light Shabbat candles, we sanctify Shabbat, we do Havdalah. Those are the positive mitzvot, of which there are 248. And then there are 365, what we call negative mitzvot. Not negative because they're bad, negative because they are, don't do's. Don't write on Shabbat. Don't cook on Shabbat. Don't eat shellfish, etc. And so he says the 248 positive commandments and the 365 negative commandments. Efes masha anachnu ein masigim haTorah ma'atzmenu misichlenu. Don't think for a second that we could not achieve the knowledge of Torah on our own accord and through our own intellect. Okay, already that to me is a surprising statement. So he's saying right off the bat that the whole Torah, all of the mitzvot, the positive ones and the negative ones, we could learn them ourselves, even if God had not given us the Torah. Hu mechamat hachamriut asher hu masach hamavdi lahasig or haruchaniut. But because of the materialism that we're stuck in, which is, he says, a masach hamavdi, a separating curtain, which keeps us from achieving or haruchaniut, the light of the Spirit. Had it not been for us being stuck in materialism, we might be able to achieve that light. Amna misha yeshlo hitpashut hagashmiut v'hitgabrut haruchaniut hu yachol hasig be'en sichlo ma'atzmo haTorah. But somebody who is able to throw off physicality and let one's spiritual side overpower oneself, that person is able to achieve with their intellect the whole Torah. Ki haramach evarim haruchaniim hem ba'atzma mitzvot aseh v'shasa gidim ba'atzma mitzvot la ta'aseh. Because the 248 bones, spiritual bones, they themselves are the positive mitzvot. So there's a midrash that the 248 positive mitzvot correspond to the 248 bones in our body. Now, if you were to tell me, Rabbi Rotenberg, scientifically, there are not exactly 248 bones. And in fact, over the course of a human being's life, from the time they're a baby to an adult, bones fuse from the time they're an infant all the way to their adult. So is there 248? Throw that scientific notion out the window for a second. Because what he's saying here is midrashically, the 248 positive mitzvot correspond to our bones. And the 365 negative mitzvot correspond to tendons. But he says, not like literal tendons, but spiritual tendons, our muscles inside of our body. Which is to say, the mitzvot we can find in ourselves, we have them inside us. We have the ability. The light is there. The question is, what does it take to tap into that light that God has planted in us? 248 spiritual bones, 365 spiritual tendons. Forget if there's really that many, but that is the midrash, as if to say it's all in here already. V'lachen Avraham Avinu. And he says, take Abraham as an example here. Alav Hashalom, may peace be on him. Asher nizdakech hachomer shalo. He was able to completely minimize his material self. Hisig meramach evarav shasa gidav shalo. Haruchaniyut shel kol haTorah kula. He himself was able to tap into those 248 bones and 365 sinews. That is to say, the spiritual bones, the spiritual sinews, the light that is in his body already. Shel kol haTorah kula ad shelo nina. And he was able to decipher the entire Torah before it was given. It's a good question. How could Abraham have known the Torah? The father of the Jewish people must have known the Torah. The Kedusha Levi has an answer. He said he did, even though the Torah wasn't given. Even though Abraham is generations before standing at Sinai and God, the story of God giving over the commandments, Abraham, who was able to connect to his spiritual self by completely minimizing his material self, he was able to decipher the entire Torah. And this is why it's written in the Haggadah, Ilu kervanu lifnei har Sinai velo natan et Torah dayenu. If God brought us to Mount Sinai but did not give us the Torah, it would have been enough. Kihine noda shebema amad har Sinai paska zuhamata. Because it's known, we learn in the Talmud, that when standing at Mount Sinai, the Israelites are able to throw off all of the word is like pollution, contamination. Klomar shebehachanat matan Torah. That is to say that the preparation for receiving the Torah that we'll read during Shavuot was, we'll keep reading, Dahainu behagbalat ha'am saviv, that is to say, in the people surrounding the mountain, uvefrishatan shlosha yamim nishotehem, and by not having relations with their spouses for 3 days, asher hayu domim l'malachim, they were in a state of meditation, intense prep for 3 days to get the Torah. If we'll read on Monday, they had to wash their clothes. They had to separate from their spouses, that is to say, all the material parts of our body, the things that, the physical side of us. They minimized it as much as possible for 3 days, knowing mentally that they were going to receive the Torah. How would you prepare? If you knew in 3 days, what kind of meditation would you do? Would you fast? for part of each day? Would you fast, between sunrise and sunset in meditation and prayer? How would you pray? What clothes would you wear? He says they were domim lamalachim. By the time they got to Mount Sinai, they were like angels. I don't know if you've ever felt this way at the end of Yom Kippur, where you haven't eaten for a whole day. If you wear a kittel, you're in, a beautiful white robe, and there you are after a whole day of prayer, standing before God at Ne'ilah. It's a very powerful moment. Well, this is like Ne'ilah times 3, except it's times even more than that because they're at Mount Sinai, and they know they're about to come in contact with the source of all life. And when the Israelites drew close, they were able to minimize, completely pulverize, the word is, their physical self, and comprehend the entire Torah even before it was given. There they are at Mount Sinai. And even before God comes down and says, I am the God who took you, I am Adonai who took you out of the land of Egypt, they understood the Torah. They felt it. They connected to that light within. Amru, Har Sinai Pasku, and thus we read in the Talmud on Shabbat 146a that when they're standing at Har Sinai, they're able to throw off all of the contamination. Har Sinai ba'atzmo v'hachanatan l'matan Torah nifsaka zehumata. Then standing at Mount Sinai, just that moment itself, and the preparation, they were able to throw off all of that pollution. V'kevan shepaska zehumata hisigu haTorah. Shatorah hi haramach evarim haruchaniim v'hashasa gidim haruchaniim. And in that moment, they were able to comprehend the entire Torah, which consists of the 248 spiritual bones inside our body and the 365 spiritual sinews inside our body. The light inside of our body, the wisdom with which our body was built, has Torah in it, and we can tap into it. It's hard. I don't know what it takes to get to that place that the Israelites were at when they stood at Mount Sinai, where Abraham was for his whole life. What kind of prayer does it take? What kind of meditation? What kind of limitations on our own physical selves does it take in order to discover within ourselves those 248 spiritual bones and 365 spiritual sinews, the laws of Torah? So this is the first text. Where does Torah come from? First of all, even before the Torah was given at Mount Sinai, Torah exists within ourselves. It exists in the universe. It's discoverable if only we can get past our material concerns. By the way, I don't believe the Kedushat Levi is, he's not an ascetic. Part of moving past our physical concerns is sanctifying physical things. Like on Shabbat, for instance, we have delicious foods. It's not that we shouldn't have delicious foods. It's what do you do with the physical world? Do you just take it and consume it because it's delicious and it's yours and you can? Or do you take it and you say, I can use this to connect to something more? That is part of the discovering of that internal light, that Torah within us. What does it take? So that's the first text I wanted to share. The second text is also about the moment right before the Israelites received the Torah. By the way, you might ask yourself, so what's the purpose of the Torah? If we can just find it in ourselves, why do we need the 5 books of Moses? Why do we need the 613 mitzvot written out? I think the answer is because we're human. And how many of us are really going to reach that spiritual plane where we can decipher the laws of Torah through the wisdom of our own bodies? The Torah is, in this case, according to the Kedusha Levi, a little bit of a shortcut to that discovery. We can't be expected to, reach that point where we can find that internal and eternal light that exists inside of us. And so the Torah helps us get there. Okay, this is the second text I wanted to study tonight. Also, I love how both of these texts are right before the giving of the Torah. It's a moment that is just full of potential. Can you imagine, just for a second, imagine the possibility of 600,000 Israelites surrounding a mountain, everyone with the expectation that something profound, something brand new, something full of life and wisdom is about to happen. Something powerful and dangerous. Everybody closing their eyes. And then that moment when the shofar is getting louder, before Torah is given, what that moment is just raw with potential. That's the moment he's talking about. Marvin, you said the Torah is also not just for us. So even if we think that enlightened, this Torah is for everyone. So make sure everyone is aware of this book of instructions. Indeed, we're meant to be a light to the world. And so when we live, I have a friend, Rabbi Jonathan Hodson, who quotes his grandma, who says his grandmother used to tell him, Jonathan, you might be the only Bible that people ever read. And so that's the power of living out Torah. So Marvin, when we keep the Torah, we are a light to the world. We are the light of Torah to the world. Okay, so the question here is he asked, what is the reason that Shavuot is called Ceret? Ceret. It's a strange word. It means like it kind of an assembly, but it can mean a few different things. It can mean an assembly. It can mean a ceasing. And so he goes through three different reasons why Shavuot is a holiday in rabbinic literature and in the Torah itself is called Ceret. And I'm going to read to you the third reason. He says, Ofen Hashlishi. Here's the third reason. And it comes from Al Pi Divrei HaRamban. It comes from Nachmanides. Shepeiresh al pasuk ma ta'iru u'ma ta'oraru et ahava ashetechafats. Nachmanides comments on a pasuk, on a verse from Shir HaShirim, the Song of Songs, chapter 2, verse 7. Do not stir up love ad shetechpats, until it is desired. Now that word ad shetechpats can also mean something a little different. A chefetz in Aramaic is like an object, something physical. So how is he going to read this verse? He says, do not stir up love until it is desired, until there's a desire for it. You can also read it, do not stir up love until it is until it's physical. What does that mean? Uferish, he says, Kishemagia la'adam eza hit'orerut shel yira v'ahava lahabore. When there comes to a person any kind of welling up of awe or love for God, as I tekech umiyad yireh la'asot la'kli, immediately this person wants to create a vessel for it. Let's talk about that. Also, Shaul, Shavuot Tov. Thanks for joining us in the chat. In a moment when you're feeling completely overpowered by a welling up of love for God, reverence for God, inspiration through God, and we've had these moments. I bet you've had moments like this when you've seen a beautiful sunrise. In a moment where it's not just coincidence, and you can feel that God's presence is there, and you feel God's love. In a moment when there's inspiration, for some reason you're just full of love for God, or you're full of reverence or even fear for God, and you just feel in that moment close. Immediately, Nachmanides says in this comment, this person wants to make a vessel for it. You don't just want it to be a feeling, you want to materialize it. Think about love for a spouse. If you love somebody so much, you want to do something with that feeling. And so you get a vessel, you get some flowers, which now represent all of those emotions, and you give them to this person. You say, I love you. And those flowers are now a vessel for your love. When one is full of love or reverence for God, immediately one wants to make a vessel for it. Hainu, so says the Kedusha Alevi, she'aseh tekef eza mitzvah. The Hainu shitzen tzedakah or yoshev techef lemod v'chadoma. So one in that moment turns and immediately finds a mitzvah, gives tzedakah, or learns some Torah in that moment, or something like it, he says. Ki yadua shehit orut haba'al ha'adam bipitam pitom. It's known that this kind of welling up of love or reverence for God comes to a person suddenly. Hu or shanishpa alav milamala v'nikra b'chinat neshama. It's a light. It's an inspiration that poured from above, and Kabbalistically, this is called neshama. This is called soul. Azay tzarich adam lahalbisha b'guf, and a person needs to put it in a body. Ubichdei sheyeh lachizuk uvasi shelo yeh muta. And one wants to do this so that it has some kind of fortification. It has a kind of foundation so that it won't dissipate. You don't want to lose that feeling. And so things can't just exist spiritually, intellectually. We want to give it some kind of body. This is the explanation of this verse. Ma ta'iru ma ta'oru ad eta ahava asher techpatz. Do not stir up love until it is desired. But techpatz, don't read it. Desire, read like a chefetz, like a physical thing. Ki chefetz hu milshon kli, because an object is like the language of a vessel. That is to say, hit orut hahu, Sheba el ha'adam tzarich techef umiyad kli. This kind of welling up of love for God, of connection to God, immediately requires some kind of vessel. Zehu ad shetechpatz. This is what we mean in the verse, ad shetechpatz, until you can give it a vessel. Ad kan l'shono. So is the words of Nachmanides. Av she'ein ze l'shono mamash. Even though this is not exactly what he meant, it is indeed, as the Kedusha Levi says, the spirit of what he was getting at. Hine bishad matan Torah, in this moment of the giving of the Torah, shahaya bevadai leYisrael az hitorut gedola, as there must have been for Israel this overwhelmingly powerful welling up of connection to God. As we just said, think about the prep that went into that moment. V'lo haya, but there's a problem. Lo haya lehem adain shu mitzvah lasod lehitorut kli. They didn't have in that moment any mitzvot in order to make a vessel for that connection. They felt so close to God, but because the Torah wasn't given yet, says the Kedusha Levi, they didn't have a vessel to put all of that connection. Muchrach lomar, so it's necessary for us to say shehayu mikayamin mitzvat hagbala, that they upheld the mitzvah of hagbala. He's here, Moshe Rabbeinu, alav hashalom, that Moses cautioned them about. Shaloli gabahar, to not touch the mountain. There was one mitzvah that they had. Moses told them when they approached the mountain not to ascend the mountain, not to touch it until they heard the sound of the shofar. So what the Kedusha Levi is saying is they took that mitzvah and they poured their love of God into that mitzvah. They poured that connection, that reverence, that feeling of overwhelming connection with God into that mitzvah, that one mitzvah that they had. They poured that connection into it, that inspiration. Hem hayu ne'etzrim milga. And they were ne'atzrim milga. They had refrained from touching it. Notice ne'atzrim atzeret. The question here is why this is called Ceret, this holiday. Mitzvah hazo hayu osim kli lehitorut. And with this one mitzvah, they made a vessel for their welling up of love, for their inspiration that they were feeling. Ve'al shum zeh nikra b'shem Ceret. Because of this one mitzvah into which they poured their entire spirit, the holiday is called Ceret. Because they were ne'atzrim. They refrained from touching the mountain. What I love about this teaching is it teaches us the power of one mitzvah. Each mitzvah is a vessel. And we can choose to fill it or we can choose to leave it hollow. When we light Shabbat candles, are we doing it because it's Friday night and we just do this on Friday night? Or are we filling that mitzvah, that vessel, that empty vessel, that vessel that has the possibility to hold in it this connection to God? What do we fill it with? Every time we do a mitzvah, we have the choice. Do we leave it an empty vessel or do we fill it with our prayers? Do we fill it with our hope? Do we fill it with our desire to connect to God? Do we fill it with love? Do we fill it with reverence? Do we fill it with fear? Do we fill it with laughter? What do we put inside our mitzvot? The Torah gives us 613. The Israelites here at the mountain had one. Maybe it would have been easier if we had one. We just do that, and every time we do that one mitzvah, we just fill it with everything that we're feeling. For us, we have 613. Every day, you have the chance to pray. Every day, you have the chance to refrain from eating certain foods. Every day, you have the chance to give tzedakah, to learn Torah. When we do mitzvot, our job is to fill those vessels. Fill it with love, fill it with prayers, fill it with hope, and to use that as a conduit to connect to God. Marvin, you said the importance of Judaism is that each holiday we recreate what our ancestors experienced. We have the best opportunity to learn. Then you said our biblical leaders are filled with imperfections and a symbol of humility, especially in Moses. And then you say, if such great leaders continue to learn from their respects, we come to Matan Torah, and then the story of Ruth, our connection to Hashem and humility of self will allow us to grow, to make the world a better place. That's the hope, is that we do make the world a better place. I was studying Pirkei Avot today with my son. It was a real highlight from Shabbat. And we were learning the second Mishnah in Pirkei Avot. Al shlosha divarim ha'olam omed al haTorah al ha'avodah al gemilut chasadim. The world stands on three things: Torah, service to God, and acts of loving kindness. When we do these mitzvot, Marvin, as you're saying, then the world is upheld in the way that God meant it to be. So with that, everybody, I'll invite you to take this day. We have one day. We're going to prepare to receive Torah together on Monday morning. When we are going to stand, we're going to hear the words of the Ten Commandments read from the Torah, and we are going to recreate that moment, as Marvin said in our chat, of standing at Mount Sinai. And in that moment, I'll invite you to connect to that light inside, to imagine yourself just like the Israelites standing there at Mount Sinai, filling the mitzvah of just hearing those commandments with your prayers, and filling the mitzvot that we receive from Torah with the hope for connection to God and to each other. So with that, everybody, Shavuot Tov and Chag Sameach. I wish you all a meaningful Shavuot. I hope you learned some good Torah. Tomorrow night, we are at Sinai Temple taking part in the Rabbinical Assembly and Masorti Conservative Movement's Tikkun Leil Shavuot, a link to which can be found on the website. Thank you, everybody, for joining us in the chat. To Ir Carmi, to Bruno, to Marvin, and to everybody who joined us not in the chat. I can't wait. I love this holiday. I love Torah. Thank you, Shaul. Shavuot Tov. Chag Sameach, everybody.